Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the resilience of students with an immigrant background, factors that shape well-being. This topic is based on the Directorate for Education and Skills' most recent publication, which is available on the OECD iLibrary page. Francesca Borgonovi, Senior Analyst in the Directorate for Education and Skills at the OECD, is joining us today to talk about the factors that influence the success or failure of students with an immigrant background as they enter the education systems of their host nations. Please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation to Eric Magnuson. Also, the PowerPoint being presented today is available as a handout. Just click on handout at the top of your screen to download. Francesca, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this webinar. It is my pleasure to present some of the findings of our latest report. First of all, I would like to thank the European Union because the report was co-financed by the European Union, and it is part of this Strength Through Diversity project at the OECD. I think, first of all, it's very important to remember that the report is primarily based on data from the Program for International Student Assessment, also known as PISA. And as such, some of the analysis that I will be presenting today and that are contained in the report, in a sense, depend on data availability for a large number of countries that are comparable. For example, the target population is 15-year-old students. So little can actually be said based on this report on the academic results and the broader well-being outcomes of younger but also of older students. Secondly, and this is again very important, since the data refer to 2015 as well as previous years, whenever we report trends, the most recent arrivals, particularly in Europe, are not included in the study, since in order to participate in PISA, children need to be able to have, at the very least, basic language proficiency and attend regular schools. And finally, although it would have been really interesting to know the reasons why some of these children migrated or their families migrated, as well as whether they have citizenship or not and their ethnic background, this information is not available in PISA. So our focus is very much on students who are either foreign-born or have at least one parent who was foreign-born, which we define as students with an immigrant background. And I think an important contribution of the report is that it develops a more fine-grained definition of which and different groups of students, depending on their background, and maps the broad outcomes of different groups of students. What we do find in the report is that migration flows are profoundly changing the composition of classrooms, and that in 2015, around 1 in 4 students on average across OECD countries was either foreign-born or had at least one foreign-born parent. Between 2003 and 2015, the 2 years for which we have comparable data, the percentage of students with an immigrant background increased by an average of 6 percentage points across OECD countries. But at the same time, what you see in this slide is that, and here what you do see is the prevalence of students without an immigrant background rather than students with an immigrant background, is that the percentage of students who do not have an immigrant background has actually changed differently in different countries. And something that is quite interesting is that some of the countries that witnessed major decreases in the prevalence of students without an immigrant background are countries that are not necessarily, that do not necessarily have a big experience with migration flows, such as, for example, Italy. And therefore, some of the responses that education systems, but also society needs to put in place are not necessarily as well developed or do not have a strong tradition like other countries. What we do in the report, as I said at the very beginning, is that we try to define different groups of students depending on whether they have a direct experience with international migration or whether their parents have. And so we define native-born students as students without an immigrant background. They are native-born, that's the circle, and they have native-born parents. In the case of single parent households, this would be just one native-born parent. And then when we think about students with an immigrant background, we have several categories. We have what we define as immigrant students, which is the typical definition adopted in the context of previous PISA cycles, but also by the European Union training monitoring report. These are can be defined as to whether they are foreign-born or they are native-born. First-generation immigrant students are foreign-born students who have two foreign-born parents, one foreign-born parent in the case of single-parent households. Second-generation immigrant students are native-born students who have two foreign-born parents. But in this report, we actually, because we are interested in the broad outcomes of students, we also thought about considering what are the outcomes of returning foreign-born students. These are foreign-born students who have either two native-born parents or one native-born and one foreign-born parents, or native students of mixed heritage. These are native-born students who have one native-born and one foreign-born parent. The reason why we decided to also look at the outcomes of these groups of students is because these students have an indirect experience with international displacement through at least one of their parents. And at the same time, they may have difficulties, let's say, reconciling different identities. Do they belong to the country from which they are coming from, or at least one of their parents is coming from, or the country in which they settled? Because we were looking at the broad well-being conceived in terms of academic outcomes, but also social and emotional well-being, we thought this was an important characterization. So how many students have an immigrant background? This chart actually looks at the prevalence of these four groups of students across OECD countries. And what you see is that on average, 5% of students were first-generation immigrant students, meaning that they're foreign-born with two foreign-born parents. 7% were students that were native-born with two foreign-born parents, second generation. 2% were returning foreign-born students, and 9% are students who have one native-born and one foreign-born parent, students of mixed heritage. And what you do see in this chart is that even for countries like, for example, the United Kingdom or Germany, that have a similar overall percentage of students with an immigrant background, the exact makeup can be rather different. And here it's important to note that these data refer to the pre-refugee crisis. In Germany, a lot of students are actually second-generation immigrant students, while in the United Kingdom, there is a much greater prevalence of first-generation immigrant students. And so some of the challenges that the students themselves, but also their families, need to face, and the responses that education systems and societies need to put in place to help these students overcome vulnerabilities in different domains are reasonably going to be different. A second key innovation of this report is that we try to take a whole child perspective. And so we try to actually look at a range of outcomes that schools, but also societies, need to help students achieve. We looked at academic outcomes, and we define academic resilience as the ability immigrant students with an immigrant background have of reaching the PISA proficiency level 2 in reading, mathematics, and science. And we chose the PISA proficiency level 2 because this is the level that is considered to be the baseline level in order to fully being able to participate in society. We look at the social dimension and whether students report feeling like they belong at school. We look at emotional adjustment, considering both whether students report high satisfaction with their life and low schoolwork related anxiety. And finally, we look at the motivational dimension and whether students report a high level of motivation to achieve. And in this graph, what we try to show is how the outcomes of the different groups of students vary and how they compare to the outcomes achieved by students without an immigrant background. So the gray bar represent the outcomes of students without an immigrant background in the 5 dimensions that we use to characterize the academic and broader well-being of students. And what you see is that if we take academic underperformance as an example, all groups of students with an immigrant background do worse than students without an immigrant background. In other words, they are less likely to underperform. They're more likely to underperform. The disadvantage is most pronounced for first-generation immigrant students and least pronounced for native students of mixed heritage. But at the same time, you do see a disadvantage that affects all students, and all these differences are actually statistically significant. Then what you do see is that in terms of sense of belonging, and this is what is most interesting, indeed, first-generation immigrant students are the ones that are most disadvantaged, but in this case, native students of mixed heritage actually display slightly worse outcomes than second-generation immigrant students. So in this case, what we do observe is that there is a definite disadvantage associated in terms of sense of belonging with coming from a mixed heritage family. Similar story with regard to low satisfaction with life. Again, the group of students who actually reports the worst outcomes in this dimension are actually returning foreign-born students. This is a small proportion of students with an immigrant background overall, but still they are the ones that appear to be having the hardest time in terms of reconciling where they end up, possibly they may have left friends in the country they left, and etc. And all students appear to suffer from anxiety related to schoolwork, but the students with an immigrant background appear to suffer the most. Another interesting story that emerges from the analysis that we carried out in the report is that, by contrast, when we think about motivation to achieve, students with an immigrant background report a greater motivation than students without an immigrant background. And this is a very important finding, because whenever we think about this group of students, we should consider that they're highly motivated to achieve. Often they and their families value education very, very strongly, and they see schools and education more widely as a springboard for social mobility. I will present results by country on the different indicators, and the interesting story there is indeed that different groups of students show different outcomes in different countries. So the specific vulnerability differs depending on the group of students that is considered and the education system in which they participate. But what we tried to do was also to develop an overall indicator of the ability of students to achieve good academic results, to report a sense of belonging at school and to achieve good life satisfaction. What we call these students are being academically sound and socially and emotionally well adapted. And here what I show you is the difference in the percentage of students who are academically sound and socially and emotionally well adapted, depending on whether they are first generation immigrant students, so foreign-born students with 2 foreign-born parents, and students without an immigrant background, native students with 2 native-born parents. And what you see is a marked difference between these 2 groups of students, but also a large degree of variability across different countries. For example, in Finland, we do observe that native students have a very, very high likelihood of being academically sound and socially and emotionally well adapted, but first-generation immigrant students appear to have some of the worst results in this dimension, particularly considering that native students do so well in Finland. And here what you see is how different groups of students with an immigrant background compare with respect to native students in that country. So the blue bar, and when the bar is dark, it means that the difference between this group of students and native students is statistically significant at the 5% level. The dot are second generation immigrant students, and the triangle are first generation immigrant students. And what you see again is that indeed, on average, all these 3 groups are disadvantaged compared to native students, and the relation between the 3 sources of disadvantage is that first generation immigrant students suffer the greatest disadvantage, followed by second generation and native students of mixed heritage. But the degree, the relative disadvantage that different groups of students face in different countries varies importantly. Again, in this case, looking at Finland, the disadvantage faced by first-generation immigrant students is very marked, compared, for example, with Italy, where first-generation and second-generation immigrant students face a rather similar level of disadvantage. And here I will go a little bit quickly, but I wanted to show you the specific level of disadvantage for first-generation immigrant students and native students when looking at different dimensions of academic outcomes, but also social, emotional, and motivational outcomes. So here, what you see is the percentage of students who attain baseline levels of academic proficiency. As I said before, PISA proficiency level 2 in reading, mathematics, and science. The bar are first-generation immigrant students, and the diamond are native students. And whenever you see a number next to the country name, what you see there is the difference between the 2 groups. If there's no number, it means that the difference between the 2 groups is not statistically significant. For example, in the case of Canada, Ireland, or New Zealand. What we try to investigate is actually whether differences in outcomes depend when we consider students that are foreign-born with foreign-born parents, in other words, first-generation immigrant students, upon the age at which they arrived, considering the fact that students who arrive late may have additional difficulties related to language, but also difficulties related to social integration, because these children may have already forged friendships, strong friendships, may already have had instruction in another country, and so maybe less easily, let's say, adaptable or adapted in a new education system. And what you see in this slide is that indeed there is a large difference when we compare students who arrived before the age of 12 or students who arrived at or after the age of 12. The students who arrive late in an education system may therefore need additional and intensive support in order to be able to catch up with students who do not have an immigrant background. Here what I show is the percentage of students who report a strong sense of belonging at school by immigrant background, comparing first-generation immigrant students and native students. And again, what you do see is that there is a marked difference when considering the sense of belonging reported by students who arrived at or after the age of 12 and students who arrived before the age of 12. Germany is a very interesting case. The difference is very, very marked, but it's also marked in countries like Sweden, the United Kingdom, Norway, Austria, or Spain. Again, we see differences in satisfaction with life as reported by the students and in the extent to which students report being anxious about doing schoolwork. By contrast, as I said at the very beginning, there are differences in motivation to achieve, but on average, and this is the interesting finding, native students report lower achievement motivation than first-generation immigrant students, and differences are extremely marked in countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, or Sweden, for example. In other countries, differences go in the other direction, or there are no differences to report. I think an important contribution that this report makes is that it shows how the outcomes of students with an immigrant background depend very markedly upon the education systems in which they attend school, as well as, I would say, society. Education systems are obviously very, very important, but the overall welfare and social arrangements that are available in a country to support these students and their families is equally important. And so what we tried to do was actually, whenever we had enough information, enough data points, and here what I show is data that pulls together different editions of PISA in order to have a sufficient number of observation by country of origin. It shows the likelihood, the percentage point difference between students with an immigrant students and native students, depending on the country of origin in reaching baseline levels of academic proficiency. So at the very left of the slide, what you see are students who migrated or have families who migrated to Switzerland from Albania, Turkey, Spain, Italy, Germany, and France, and what is their likelihood of achieving baseline levels of academic proficiency compared to native students. So in this case, French students who migrated to Switzerland have a higher likelihood compared to children from Switzerland with parents who are also from Switzerland of achieving baseline levels of academic proficiency, with no difference between first and second generation immigrant students. And what you do see, on the other hand, is that many other groups face a penalty, a disadvantage, and importantly, all these findings account for socioeconomic condition of the family. So they try to control as much as possible for the self-selection of different groups into different countries. And here you also see differences depending on country of origin, and depending on the country in which the students end up, for a selected number of destination countries in sense of belonging. And again, what you do see is that for students who have the same socioeconomic condition, who come from the same country and end up in different countries of origin, or who come from the same country of origin but end up in different destination countries, the outcomes are different. I encourage you to look into the report because we can actually show a wider group of countries of origin and countries of destination. We also look at a set of individual factors and how they shape the vulnerability that different groups of students with an immigrant background face. We look at gender. We will look at whether the student works for pay or participates in unpaid work, and enrollment in early childhood education and care. And finally, the language that the students report speaking most often in the home setting. What we find is that there are no differences across genders, in the sense that the gender patterns that we see among students with an immigrant background mirror those that we find in the country in which they settle. We try to also look at potential differences depending on the region of origin, to look at potential differences depending on the cultures and traditions. But again, we didn't see any differences depending on gender norms in the country of origin. There are differences in different countries in participation in paid and unpaid work, with many groups of students with an immigrant background participating more in paid and unpaid work, and this having in turn an effect on some of the academic and broader outcomes that we examine. In some countries, we also see differences in enrollment in early education and care, although the effect that we see on the outcomes is not large. And this obviously, whenever we think about enrollment in the country's early childhood education and care system, depends on them being second generation. In other words, being born in the country in which they eventually follow primary and then secondary education. I will go a little bit more in detail in terms of results for language, because this is a crucial factor shaping the academic results, but also the broader social and emotional well-being of students with an immigrant background. Here what I show is the percentage point difference compared to native students who speak the language of the test, the language of instruction, of native speaking immigrant students. These are students who have who at home report speaking most often the language of instruction, and non-native speaking immigrant students. These are students who report speaking another language most often in the home setting. And what you do see is that there is generally a much greater disadvantage for students who are non-native speakers. What you also see is a disadvantage in terms of sense of belonging at school. And one set of analysis that we did in the report, and again, I encourage you to look at the report for detailed findings, is to examine the specific match between this language that the students report speaking at home and the language of instruction. And what we find is that there is a strong difference depending on the level of dissimilarity between these two languages. In other words, my native language is Italian. If I end up in a country like France, where the language is not very different, my disadvantage is considerably smaller than the disadvantage faced, for example, by somebody who speaks Hungarian in the home setting. We also look at the role of the family context, looking at the socioeconomic condition of the family of origin, the level of parental involvement, and the extent to which parents use choice, and what are the characteristics that they value whenever exercising such choice. What we find is that in many countries, immigrant students, and I remind you that these are first generation and second generation immigrant students, are socioeconomically disadvantaged compared to native students. However, what we do find is that mixed heritage and returning foreign-born students are not socioeconomically disadvantaged. In fact, in many countries, they are socioeconomically advantaged compared to native-born students, students without an immigrant background. So the socioeconomic factors play an important role in explaining differences in academic proficiency between immigrant students and native students, but they do not explain the difference that we observe for other groups of students. Here what you see is the difference in the likelihood that students will be reaching academic results in PISA, our definition of academic proficiency, before and after accounting for students' socioeconomic status. And what we find is that overall differences in socioeconomic status explain around a fifth of differences in academic proficiency. However, again, and this is, I would say, the beauty of using a large cross-national study like PISA, there are important differences across countries. In some countries, socioeconomic status doesn't explain much. In other countries, it explains a lot of the differences that we observe. However, socioeconomic status doesn't explain a lot of the differences that we observe between native students and different students with an immigrant background in a sense of belonging. And a similar story emerges when we look at satisfaction with life. As I said, we looked at immigrant-native differences in the criteria that parents use to choose a school. And what we see here is the difference in the percentage of immigrant parents and native parents. We indicated that the following criteria are important when choosing a school. And again, importantly, we report results after accounting for socioeconomic status to compare apples and apples and oranges with oranges. What we find is that native-born parents are more likely to choose schools on the basis of whether the schools offer particular courses in the school subjects and whether the school has an active and a pleasant climate. On the other hand, the parents of students with an immigrant background are more likely, for example, to choose a school on the basis of whether it has financial aid available. So support, financial support is an important consideration. And as we saw before, there is a difference in terms of the socioeconomic makeup of these families. We also look at the role that schools and teachers can play. Here I think we have interesting findings. What we find is that immigrant students are more likely to be the victims of frequent bullying. Here you see the percentage of native students and of immigrant students who report being the victims of frequent bullying in different countries. And what you see is that in the vast majority of countries, immigrant students are more likely to be the victims of bullying. They are also more likely to feel that they are being unfairly treated by their teachers, perhaps because these are teenagers, 15-year-olds. Overwhelmingly, students report being unfairly treated by their teachers, but in general, immigrant students are more likely to do so. They are also more likely to repeat grades, this actually holds what you see when you look at the bars here. This holds importantly and crucially after we take socioeconomic status, but also performance in the PISA core subjects into account. So here, whenever we are presenting results, the bars are actually showing that immigrant students of equal performance and socioeconomic status are more likely to have repeated at least a grade up to the age of 15 compared to similarly proficient and similarly wealthy or families with similar levels of education and occupation as them. But the picture that may emerge looking at this data could be considered negative, but in fact what we do see is that immigrant students report that their teachers give them more feedback. And this actually holds even when we account for science performance. So they're not receiving more feedback just because they are lower achievers. What these signals, in our view, is that the teachers are very much willing to support these students and do understand that these students may need additional support. At the same time, they may not be well equipped in dealing with the specific problems and needs that these students have. In fact, when we look at another OECD study, the Teaching and Learning International Survey, which was implemented in 2013, teachers often report needing professional development to deal with multicultural classrooms. In many countries, when teachers undergo their training, they may be taught how to teach math, how to teach history, how to teach a language of instruction, but they're very, very rarely taught how to deal with diverse classrooms and the pedagogical approaches that may best support students. In fact, because diversity is in itself diverse, I can be diverse from the next person, who is diverse from the next person, but we're all different from each other. It is very, very difficult to support teachers in order for them to be able to support diverse students' populations. Finally, what the report shows, and I think this is a very positive message that emerges from the report, is that most students with an immigrant background and their parents are highly motivated to achieve and see education as a springboard for social mobility. Here, what you see is the percentage of students who report expecting to complete a tertiary degree, and the blue bars represent native students. The black diamonds indicate immigrant students. And what you see is that in many countries, immigrant students are more likely to expect to complete tertiary education. In many countries, they're not. In fact, what you do see is that on average, there's no difference. But this slide is actually not considering the fact that students with an immigrant students are generally socioeconomically disadvantaged. So when you take into consideration and you compare native students and immigrant students of similar socioeconomic condition, there is a considerably greater likelihood for immigrant students of expecting to complete tertiary education. At the same time, and I think this is where education systems, but also societies more widely are failing these students, is that many of these students actually lack the baseline levels of skills that would be necessary for them to be able to complete a tertiary degree. And with this, I would like to thank you. I will be happy to answer any questions, and I invite you to browse through this very comprehensive report and look for more information about our Strength Through Diversity project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. We have had a few questions from our participants today. One comes, what was the most surprising finding in this study?
I think the finding on the lower sense of belonging and the lower life satisfaction of native students with mixed heritage was particularly surprising, but at the same time it does reflect some of the difficulties that many students in today's world are facing with reconciling different identities. And I do think that there is an important role to play for schools in order to help them overcome these difficulties and adjust positively in society.
We have another participant who's asking about parents of students with an immigrant background. They ask, what advice would you have for parents of an immigrant student to best help their students succeed?
I think many of these parents are doing already quite a lot. What we see, and again, I couldn't show slides because there are just too many to show all, is that these parents have very high expectations for their children. They try their best to support them. Sometimes they don't have the information on the structure of the education system in order to best support their children. Some are also finding it difficult because of language problems or lack of understanding of what is required of them to participate in the school community as much as other parents. And I think it's very important for schools, teachers, and school principals and other educators to find ways to better engage these parents and together support children.
We have a question from someone who missed the beginning of the presentation. They're asking if you can clarify the operationalizations used for immigrant background children, and particularly second-generation immigrants, natives of mixed heritage, and first-generation immigrants. And, it's a long question, also, do these operationalizations include either children who are refugees or who have parents who are refugees?
Thank you for the question. Indeed, what we said at the beginning is that because of data limitations, we do not know the reason as to why the family migrated. So we may have refugee children, but we don't know the reason for migration. We also don't know their ethnicity, and we don't know their citizenship. So all this information, unfortunately, is not present in the data. What we consider in this study is students with an immigrant background, and these students are the overall group of students is students who are either foreign-born who have at least one foreign-born parent. The specific definition of the four groups of students that we examine can be found here. And first-generation immigrant students are foreign-born students who have two foreign-born parents or one foreign-born parent in the case of single parent households. Second-generation immigrant students are native-born students who have, again, two foreign-born parents or one foreign-born parent in the case of single-parent families. And then we have immigrant students with at least one native-born parent. Returning foreign-born students are foreign-born students who have either two native-born, one native-born and one foreign-born, or one native-born in the case of single-parent households. And native students of mixed heritage are native students who have one native-born and one foreign-born parent.
We have a few more questions coming in. Someone's asking, how do you take into account frequent moving in your findings? Typically, migrant families, especially such as asylum seekers and refugees, who move quite often even within a host country.
What we have information on is whether students change school, but we don't know the extent to which they actually moved within the country in which we picked them up at the age of 15. At the same time, and these are important dimensions of disadvantage. At the same time, this study provides an overall big picture of the disadvantage that is associated with different migration backgrounds, but the overall project that we're doing at the OECD on the strength through diversity actually looks at more specific outcomes of different groups, asylum seekers, refugees, and their pathways into integrating in different education systems.
Okay, someone else is asking, are there things outside of the education sector that have an impact on the resilience of immigrant students' healthcare, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the dimensions that we look at is life satisfaction, and this is a positive affective state. Lack of life satisfaction doesn't necessarily mean depression or mental health problems, but at the same time, what we do know is that many of the students who have an immigrant background, particularly if they face difficult migration pathways, may have very high levels of stress. Many may have depression, and therefore it's very important to ensure that healthcare professionals are involved in their care, but also that schools engage effectively with these other types of social services. What I said at the very end, that these students and their families value education very, very strongly, also means that oftentimes the schools are key and focal points to engage these families and understand what their needs are. So there definitely could be a strong link between different sectors. Another dimension, another issue is housing policies. What we do see is that the concentration of students with an immigrant background in specific schools may create additional hurdles for the students, but also their teachers, and therefore should be avoided. But at the same time, this can be difficult unless the housing sector provides responses, so that there are not specific areas of the city that host very large populations with an immigrant background.
Another participant is asking, because of tensions around the topic of immigration, there are some that might be opposed to new integration measures in education. In response to this, what benefits are there for economies and countries to ensure that academic resilience of immigrant students is supported?
I think what I said, that when discussing the specific challenges that teachers face in dealing with diverse classrooms, in other words, the need to develop personalized and individualized support actually goes to the benefit of everyone. This means that actually, rather than seeing the investment in teacher training as a cost, in other words, we need to invest so much in these teachers to support the students with an immigrant background effectively, actually it will benefit all students, irrespective of their immigrant background.
I think we have time for just one more question that's come in. This is a little bit more specific. Someone saying, with the understanding that Canadian workers are ranked as the most educated and highly skilled in the OECD countries, and that Canadian students perform well at all levels of education, yet, it's kind of a long one, yet Canadian employers in all sectors report skill shortages. In fact, talent availability is a top of mind issue for Canadian businesses. How do you suggest that Canada look at preparing immigrant students and making them resilient in order to prepare them along with native students for technologies that are transforming the workforce and will drive demand for technology-related skills in all sectors?
Wow, great question. What we do see in our data is that students with an immigrant background in Canada are actually very well supported. There is no disadvantage in terms of academic outcomes between students with an immigrant background and students without such background. There is a big focus on language support for new arrivals. There is a big focus on having community-wide initiatives to integrate students, but also their families, and making sure they are feeling part of the community. So I do think that immigrants are already contributing very, very importantly to the overall skill debate that is present in Canada. On the specificities as to whether there is an advantage or something that could be done at the level of the digital economy, that we don't know.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca, and thank you to all of our participants for your interest in this topic and the OECD's work on education in general. If you would like to find out more about our study on migration and education, you can find the publication on the OECD iLibrary under the name The Resilience of Students with an Immigrant Background, Factors that Shape Wellbeing. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube page, which is EduSkills OECD. Once again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.